People always told me I was lucky. They looked at my husband and smiled. They looked at our beautiful home, our grown children, the vacations, the anniversary photos hanging across our hallway, and they assumed we had built the perfect marriage. What they never knew was that I paid for almost everything. The mortgage, the groceries, the utilities, the children's school fees, the medical bills, even the anniversary dinners everyone thought my husband had planned. For 20 years, I convinced myself that marriage wasn't about keeping score. If I could carry us financially while he got back on his feet, then that's what love meant. Every time someone praised him for being a devoted husband, I smiled. Every time he accepted the compliments without correcting them, I smiled again, because exposing him would have embarrassed us both. But everything changed the morning I walked into my office and found out the company was restructuring. My position wasn't eliminated, but my salary was cut by almost half. For the first time in 2 decades, I couldn't keep pretending nothing had changed. That evening, I sat across from my husband at dinner. I looked him in the eyes. My hands were shaking. "I can't keep paying for everything anymore," I said quietly. "I need you to start covering the household expenses." He didn't answer. He simply stared at me. Then he laughed. Not the laugh of a loving husband. The laugh of a man who had just heard the funniest joke of his life. In that moment, I realized I had never actually known the man I'd been married to. And what happened over the following weeks destroyed everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the price of silence. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever discovered something about someone you loved that completely changed the way you saw them? If you have, let me know in the comments with just one word: yes. I'd love to hear your story. And if you're new here and you enjoy emotional stories filled with family secrets, betrayal, unexpected twists, and endings that stay with you long after the story is over, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now, let me tell you what happened after my husband laughed. My name is Denise Hayes. I'm 48 years old, and if you had met me 6 months ago, you probably would have said I had everything a woman could want. A beautiful 4-bedroom home in a quiet suburb. 2 grown children who had graduated from college. A stable career as a senior operations manager at a healthcare company. And a husband I'd been married to for 23 years. His name was Victor. To everyone else, Victor was charming. He remembered birthdays. He carried groceries for elderly neighbors. He never forgot an anniversary post on social media. Whenever we attended church or family gatherings, people would joke that I had won the husband lottery. I used to laugh along with them. It was easier than explaining the truth. The truth wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches, no bruises, no public humiliation, just thousands of tiny moments that slowly became normal. Whenever a bill arrived, Victor would casually slide it toward me. "You handle finances better than I do." When the car needed repairs, "You've always been good at budgeting." When our daughter needed tuition, "You make more than I do." When our son needed help with rent after graduation, "You know I would if I could." At first, those words sounded reasonable. Marriage is about supporting each other. There were seasons when one person carried more than the other. At least, that's what I believed. Victor had lost a good sales job early in our marriage. He promised it was temporary. He took smaller jobs while looking for something better. Then he started a business. That business failed. Then another. Then another. Every setback came with another promise. "Just give me a little more time." And I did. Years passed so gradually that I never noticed the pattern forming. I wasn't supporting my husband through a difficult season anymore. I had become the season. One Friday evening, our daughter, Maya, invited us to dinner at her apartment. Halfway through the meal, she smiled at Victor. "Dad, thanks again for helping me with my first apartment." Victor nodded proudly. "I'm always here for my kids." I lowered my eyes to my plate. I had paid the security deposit, the first 6 months of rent, the furniture, even the moving truck. Victor hadn't lied. He had simply allowed everyone else to believe a story he never corrected. That ride home was quiet. I wanted to say something, to ask why he never gave me credit, to ask why he seemed so comfortable accepting praise for sacrifices I had made. But after so many years, silence had become part of our marriage. It felt easier than conflict. A week later, my company announced a mandatory staff meeting. Rumors spread through the office before anyone entered the conference room. Budget cuts, department restructuring, salary adjustments. I remember sitting in my chair, trying to convince myself everything would be fine. It wasn't. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my office carrying a letter that changed everything. My salary wasn't gone, but nearly 40% of it was. For the first time in over 20 years, the math didn't work. I sat in my car after work, staring at the steering wheel. There was only one conclusion. Victor would finally have to become the partner I'd spent decades believing he wanted to be. I didn't know that the conversation waiting for me at home wouldn't just expose our finances. It would expose our marriage. I waited until after dinner. Victor was in the living room, watching a basketball game with the volume turned low. He looked relaxed, completely unaware that I had rehearsed this conversation in my head a dozen times during the drive home. I sat across from him. "Can we talk?" He muted the television. "Sure. What's going on?" I placed the folded letter from my company on the coffee table between us. "We had restructuring today." He glanced at the envelope but didn't pick it up. "Okay. My salary has been reduced." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Reduced by how much?" "Almost 40%. For a moment, he said nothing. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I was looking for partnership. "I've gone over our finances," I continued. "I can still cover part of the household expenses, but not all of them anymore." He leaned back. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I need you to start paying some of the bills." His face stayed expressionless. "The mortgage, the utilities, the insurance. We'll have to divide them." He let out a short laugh. Not loud, not cruel, just dismissive. "You can't be serious." I blinked. "I am serious. You've always handled the bills." "I've handled them because someone had to." "Exactly." He shrugged as though he'd just solved the problem. "So, keep handling them." I stared at him. "I just told you I can't. You'll figure it out." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were loud, but because they were effortless. As if my struggle was nothing more than an inconvenience. "I've figured it out for 20 years, I said quietly. "I'm asking you to help." Victor sighed dramatically. "I knew this promotion of yours would change you." I frowned. "What does my promotion have to do with anything? You started making good money, and now suddenly you're keeping score." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This isn't about keeping score. It's about reality. Our income has changed. So our responsibilities have to change too. He stood and began pacing. "I've never asked you to pay for everything." I almost laughed. "You never had to ask." Every bill had somehow found its way into my hands. Every financial emergency had somehow become my responsibility. Every promise to contribute had somehow been delayed until next month. Victor rubbed his forehead. "I have business expenses. I need cash flow. If I start paying all these bills, the business will suffer." I looked at him carefully. "What business?" He froze. It lasted only a second, but I noticed. "The consulting work. You've barely mentioned that in months." "It's still there." "Really? Then show me." His eyes narrowed. "Show you what?" "The accounts. The income. The expenses. If we're supposed to be partners, I think it's fair that we both know where the money is going." His expression changed instantly. The easy confidence disappeared. His jaw tightened. "So now you're auditing me?" "No. I'm asking for transparency." He grabbed his car keys from the kitchen counter. "I don't need this tonight." Without another word, he walked out. A few seconds later, I heard the front door slam. Then his car sped away. I sat alone in the silent house. For 23 years, I had believed money was our biggest problem. That night, I realized it wasn't. Secrets were. And somewhere behind Victor's anger was something he was desperate for me not to see. Victor didn't come home until after midnight. I was awake when I heard his keys slide into the front door. He walked past the living room without looking at me. "I don't want to argue tonight," he said flatly. Neither did I, so I let him go upstairs. The next morning, he acted as though nothing had happened. He poured himself a cup of coffee, kissed me lightly on the forehead, and asked if I needed anything from the grocery store. 23 years ago, that version of Victor would have comforted me. Now it confused me. How could someone avoid a conversation that important so easily? Before leaving for work, I opened our family budget spreadsheet. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every insurance premium, every tuition payment, every vacation, every major purchase. They had all come from one account. Mine. I wasn't looking for evidence anymore. I was looking for understanding. Had I ignored the truth because I wanted peace? Or because I was afraid of what would happen if I demanded more? That afternoon, I called the bank. Not to spy on Victor, just to understand our finances. The representative confirmed something I already knew. Our joint account was used for household expenses, but there was very little activity from Victor's side. His deposits were small. Irregular. Nothing close to what would support the lifestyle he claimed his consulting business provided. I thanked the representative and hung up. Something wasn't adding up. That evening, Maya stopped by unexpectedly with coffee and pastries. "You sounded tired on the phone yesterday," she said as she handed me a cup. "I'm okay." She studied my face. "No, you're not." I hesitated. For years, I had protected Victor's image in front of our children. If he missed a payment, I covered it. If he forgot a promise, I made an excuse. If they thanked him for something I had paid for, I stayed quiet. But I was too exhausted to pretend. "I've been carrying more than I should have," I admitted. Maya frowned. "What do you mean?" I took a slow breath. "Your father hasn't been paying the household bills." She laughed softly. "Mom, Dad's always worked." "I know. So have I." "No," I said gently. "You don't understand. I've been paying almost everything for years." Her smile disappeared. She stared at me as if she had misheard. "Everything?" I nodded. "The house?" "Yes." "My college?" "Yes." "My apartment?" "Yes." She sank into the chair across from me. I know what you thought. Because that's what everyone thought." Tears filled her eyes. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I kept believing things would change." The room fell silent. Finally, Maya reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry you carried that alone." It was the first time in years that someone had acknowledged the weight I had been carrying. Later that night, Victor finally came home. He was unusually cheerful. He whistled as he walked through the kitchen. Then his phone buzzed on the counter. He had left it there while he went upstairs to shower. The screen lit up. A message appeared. "Don't forget lunch tomorrow. Same place. I'll bring the paperwork." There was no name, just a phone number. I wasn't the kind of wife who searched through phones. I never had been. But after everything that had happened, I couldn't stop staring at that message. Paperwork? What paperwork? And why had he never mentioned it? For the first time in our marriage, I wondered if the biggest secret Victor was keeping had nothing to do with money at all. I told myself to ignore the message. Victor deserved his privacy. For 23 years, I had respected that boundary. But respect is built on trust. And trust had begun to crack. When Victor came downstairs, his phone was exactly where he'd left it. He picked it up, slipped it into his pocket, and smiled. "I've got a meeting tomorrow." "With your consulting client?" I asked. He nodded without hesitation. "Yes." "What company?" He paused for the briefest moment. "A manufacturing firm." "Have you worked with them before?" "Not really." Then he kissed my forehead and walked out to take a phone call on the patio. It was the first time I noticed how carefully he avoided simple questions. The next morning, I went to work, but I couldn't concentrate. Numbers blurred together on my computer screen. Emails piled up unanswered. By lunchtime, I had made a decision. Not because I wanted to catch Victor in a lie, because I needed to know whether I was imagining things. His text had mentioned lunch. Same place. There was only one restaurant Victor visited often enough to describe it that way. A quiet bistro about 15 minutes from his office. At 12:30, I parked across the street. I felt ridiculous, like someone I didn't recognize. I almost drove away. Then Victor's car pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out wearing the navy blazer I had bought him for our 20th anniversary. A few minutes later, another car arrived. A woman in her early 50s got out carrying a leather portfolio. They greeted each other with a warm hug. Not romantic. Comfortable. Familiar. They walked inside together. I stayed in my car. My heart pounded against my ribs. Maybe she was the client. Maybe I was letting fear create stories that weren't there. I waited. Nearly an hour later, they came back outside. The woman opened the portfolio. Victor signed several documents. She signed them too. Then they shook hands. Before leaving, she touched his arm and smiled. "You've waited long enough," she said. "Soon it'll finally be yours." Victor smiled back. "I've been looking forward to this day." I couldn't hear anything else. The traffic swallowed the rest of their conversation. But those two sentences echoed in my mind all afternoon. Soon it'll finally be yours. What was becoming his? A business? An investment? An inheritance? And why had I never heard a word about it? That evening, Victor walked through the front door carrying a bouquet of flowers. He hadn't brought me flowers in months. "For you," he said with an easy smile. I accepted them. "They're beautiful. I've been thinking about yesterday." "So have I. I don't like us fighting." "Neither do I." He stepped closer. "We'll figure things out." "How?" "We always do." It sounded comforting. Except he still hadn't answered my question. He still hadn't offered to pay a single bill. He still hadn't explained where his income came from, or what paperwork he had signed. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened the kitchen drawer where we kept our household documents. Insurance papers, mortgage statements, tax returns. Everything was exactly where it had always been, except for one envelope. It was addressed only to Victor. No company logo, no return address, just his name. The envelope had been tucked beneath a stack of old warranty manuals, almost as if someone didn't expect anyone to find it. I held it in my hands for several seconds. Every instinct told me to put it back, but another voice whispered something I could no longer ignore. If your husband has built part of his life in secret, you may already be living inside a lie. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. I stood alone in the kitchen. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. For a long moment, I stared at the envelope in my hands. Then I slid the papers out. The first page wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a bank statement. It wasn't a love letter. It was a legal document. At the top were the words, Property Transfer Agreement. I frowned. The property address wasn't ours. It was a commercial building downtown. The estimated value made my stomach tighten. Nearly $1 million. I flipped to the next page. Victor's name appeared several times. So did the name of the woman I had seen at the restaurant. Elaine Foster. Not as his wife. Not as a business partner. As the executor of an estate. An estate. My pulse quickened. The final page explained everything. And nothing. Victor had been named the beneficiary of the property by a man named Harold Whitmore. I searched my memory. The name meant nothing to me. Who was Harold Whitmore? And why would he leave Victor a building worth that much money? More importantly, why had my husband never mentioned it? I carefully returned every page to the envelope before heading upstairs. Victor was asleep, or pretending to be. I lay awake until morning, not because of the property, because I realized something much worse. For years, whenever we struggled financially, Victor already knew help was coming. He had simply chosen to let me keep carrying everything. The next afternoon, I took an early lunch break. Instead of going to a cafe, I drove to the county records office. If the property transfer was legitimate, there would be public records. The clerk found the file within minutes. Yes, she said. The transfer is almost complete. I tried to sound casual. Was Mr. Whitmore related to Victor? She glanced at the file. It doesn't say, but they've been connected for quite a while. How long? She looked again. Looks like almost 12 years. 12 years. I thanked her and walked outside. I couldn't breathe. 12 years. For 12 years, Victor had known this man. For 12 years, he'd been connected to an estate that could completely change our lives. For 12 years, he had watched me work overtime, skip vacations, refinance the house, drain my retirement savings, cover every emergency without complaint. And he had never once said, "Hold on, relief may be coming." Instead, he let me believe we were barely surviving. That evening, I spread every financial document I owned across the dining room table. Mortgage statements, tax returns, credit card bills, retirement accounts, receipts dating back almost 2 decades. I wasn't trying to prove Victor had lied. I already knew that. I wanted to understand the cost. After 3 hours with a calculator, legal pads, and old bank statements, I finally stopped. The total stared back at me, including the mortgage, tuition, medical bills, insurance, vacations, household repairs, and living expenses. I had contributed over $1.8 million to our family over 23 years. Victor's verified contributions. Barely a fraction of that. I leaned back in my chair. Not angry. Not crying. Just empty. The life I thought we had built together had been built almost entirely on my shoulders. The front door opened. Victor walked in carrying a takeout bag. He smiled when he saw me. "Looks like you're doing taxes." I looked him straight in the eye. "No, I'm calculating something else." He laughed. "What's that?" "The cost." His smile faded. "The cost of believing you." For the first time since we'd been married, Victor didn't have an answer, but I wasn't finished asking questions. Because tomorrow, I was going to find out exactly who Harold Whitmore was. And somehow, I already knew that answer would change everything. The next morning, I called in sick. For 23 years, I had shown up for everyone else. Today, I needed answers. I started with the simplest question. Who was Harold Whitmore? The internet offered only fragments. He had owned several commercial properties across the state. He had invested in small manufacturing companies. He kept a low profile. 3 months earlier, he had passed away at the age of 86. No mention of children. No mention of a wife. Just a brief obituary and a list of charitable donations. That wasn't enough. I needed someone who actually knew him. So I drove to the address listed for Elaine Foster's law office. The receptionist greeted me politely. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I admitted. "But I believe Ms. Foster is handling an estate involving my husband." She hesitated. "I'm sorry, but we can't discuss a client's file." "I understand." I reached into my purse and placed my business card on the desk. "My name is Denise Hayes. I'm not asking for confidential information. I'm asking for 5 minutes. If she says no, I'll leave." The receptionist disappeared down the hallway. A minute later, she returned. "Miss Foster will see you." Elaine looked exactly as she had the day before. Professional. Composed. She motioned for me to sit. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Hayes?" I took a steady breath. "My husband is Victor Hayes. I recently discovered he's inheriting a commercial property. I don't want details about the estate. I just want to know one thing. Did he hide this from me? Or was he legally prevented from telling me?" Elaine was quiet for several seconds. Then she folded her hands. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband was never prohibited from discussing the estate." The words settled over the room like heavy rain. "So he could have told me." "Yes. At any time." Elaine's voice remained calm. There was no confidentiality clause preventing him from informing his spouse. I looked down at my hands. That answer hurt more than I expected, because it removed every excuse I had secretly been hoping for. No legal restriction. No misunderstanding. Just a choice. "There is one thing I believe you deserve to know." She opened a folder. "Mr. Whitmore first amended his will 12 years ago. At that time, your husband was left with only a modest amount." I frowned. "What changed?" "Over the years, Mr. Whitmore repeatedly increased Victor's inheritance." "Why?" Elaine hesitated. "According to Mr. Whitmore's notes, he admired your husband's patience." "My husband's patience?" "Yes. He believed Victor had never once pressured him for money." I almost laughed. If only Harold Whitmore had known. Victor hadn't pressured him. Because he had me. Every month. Every year. Every sacrifice. I had unknowingly made it possible for Victor to appear patient. I had financed the image that earned him a fortune. As long as I kept paying, he could afford to wait. As I stood to leave Elaine Foster's office, she called after me. "Mrs. Hayes, there's something else." I turned around. "I believe Mr. Whitmore would have wanted you to know who he was." Elaine opened another folder and removed an old photograph. She handed it to me. The picture showed a much younger Victor standing beside an elderly man in front of a small hardware store. Both of them were smiling. "That's Harold Whitmore," Elaine said. I looked back at the photograph. So they were family. "No." "Then who was he?" Elaine smiled softly. "About 25 years ago, your husband worked at one of Mr. Whitmore's properties as a maintenance supervisor. He wasn't just an employee. He became Mr. Whitmore's closest companion after Mr. Whitmore's wife passed away." I listened without saying a word. Mr. Whitmore had no children. No close relatives. Over the years, Victor helped him manage his rental properties, drove him to doctor's appointments, and handled errands when his health declined. Mr. Whitmore trusted him completely. I nodded slowly. So the inheritance wasn't random. No. It was Mr. Whitmore's way of thanking the one person who stayed in his life when everyone else disappeared. My chest tightened. There was something tragically ironic about that. Victor had been capable of extraordinary loyalty. He had shown kindness, patience, commitment, just not inside his own marriage. Elaine continued. "Mr. Whitmore often spoke highly of your husband. He believed Victor was one of the most selfless men he'd ever met." I closed my eyes. If only he had known. Victor had been able to devote so much time to Harold Whitmore because someone else was carrying every responsibility at home. Someone else was paying every mortgage installment, every utility bill, every tuition payment, every unexpected expense. Without realizing it, I had made Victor look like a generous, patient man. Mr. Whitmore rewarded the version of Victor he saw. I had lived with the version he became when no one was watching. I thanked her and left. I drove home in silence. Everything suddenly made sense. Every failed business. Every promise that next year would be different. Every excuse. Victor had never been desperate. He had simply never needed to be. When I walked through the front door, Victor was sitting in the kitchen. He looked surprised. "I thought you were at work." "I took the day off." He smiled. "Everything okay?" I placed the envelope on the table between us. His eyes immediately recognized it. His face lost all color. You went through my things. No. I finally went through my own life. The room fell silent. Then I asked the question that had been waiting 23 years to be spoken. Victor, if you knew this inheritance was coming, if you knew one day you'd own a building worth nearly $1 million, why did you let me carry our family alone for all those years? Victor lowered his eyes. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked like a man with nowhere left to hide. He opened his mouth to answer, and what he confessed next made me question whether our marriage had ever been real at all. Victor stared at the envelope, then at me. For the first time in 23 years, he looked like a man who had run out of explanations. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched so long that I could hear the old clock in the hallway ticking. Finally, he exhaled. I was going to tell you. I shook my head. When? He didn't answer. When the papers were signed? When the money reached your account? When? His shoulders slumped. I don't know. No, I said quietly. You do know. You just don't want to say it. Victor rubbed his face with both hands. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I almost smiled. Nothing ever is. For years, every disappointment in our marriage had arrived wrapped in those same words. The business wasn't supposed to fail. The bills weren't supposed to pile up. He wasn't supposed to forget. He wasn't supposed to disappoint me. Everything had been an accident. Except now I could finally see the pattern. None of it had been accidental. It had been convenient. You want to know why I didn't tell you? He asked. Yes. He looked directly at me. Because I knew you'd expect things to change. I frowned. What does that mean? You would have wanted me to start paying for everything. I wanted you to start paying for something. I know. His voice was barely above a whisper. And I wasn't ready. The answer stunned me. Not because it was shocking. Because it was so selfish. You weren't ready? I'd gotten used to our arrangement. Our arrangement. I repeated the words slowly, tasting the bitterness in them. You call this an arrangement? Victor leaned forward. You made more money. You were better with finances. You never complained. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I complained plenty. Maybe not with words. But every overtime shift. Every vacation I canceled. Every weekend I spent catching up on work. Those were my complaints. You just chose not to hear them. He lowered his eyes. I thought you didn't mind. I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh that escapes when something is too painful to process. You thought I enjoyed carrying two adults? I thought. He stopped. Then he whispered the sentence that shattered the last piece of my marriage. I thought you'd never leave. The room went still. There it was. Not love. Not gratitude. Certainty. He had built his entire life on one belief. That no matter how much weight he placed on my shoulders, I would keep standing. He never worried about losing me. Because he never imagined I had a limit. Tears filled my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. You know what hurts the most? He looked up. It isn't the money. It isn't even the lies. It's that somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your wife. You started seeing me as your safety net. Victor opened his mouth. I'm sorry. The words came too quickly, too easily, as though an apology could erase 23 years. No, I said softly. You're sorry because I know. That's different. His face crumpled. I love you, Denise. I studied him for a long moment. Then I asked the question that had been growing inside me since this began. If my salary had never been cut, if I had kept paying every bill, would you have ever told me about Harold Whitmore? Victor's silence answered before his lips ever moved. He looked away. That was enough. I stood, walked upstairs, opened the closet, and for the first time since our wedding day, I took down the suitcase. Behind me, I heard Victor climbing the stairs. Denise, please. We can fix this. I zipped the suitcase closed without looking at him. Then I said the one sentence he never imagined he would hear. I'm not leaving because we ran out of money. I turned to face him. I'm leaving because I finally ran out of reasons to stay. Victor froze in the doorway. He realized, at that moment, that the woman he had depended on for 23 years was no longer willing to carry him. But neither of us knew that the hardest conversation was still waiting. Because the next morning, our children were coming over, and they had no idea the family they thought they knew had fallen apart overnight. The next morning, Maya arrived first. She took one look at my face and knew I hadn't slept. Mom, I'm okay. No, she said gently. You're not. A few minutes later, our son, Jordan, walked in carrying a box of donuts. He immediately sensed the tension. What's going on? Before I could answer, Victor came downstairs. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red. No one spoke. I motioned toward the dining table. Sit down. Jordan looked from me to his father. You're starting to scare me. I know. And I'm sorry. But you both deserve the truth. I placed 3 binders on the table. One contained bank statements. Another held mortgage records. The third was filled with receipts, tax returns, tuition invoices, and insurance documents dating back more than 2 decades. Maya frowned. What is all this? Our family's finances. Victor lowered his head. I opened the first binder. Your father and I have been married for 23 years. For most of that time, I paid nearly every major expense this family ever had. Jordan laughed nervously. Mom, that can't be right. I slid the mortgage statements toward him. Read the account numbers. He did. His expression changed. Every payment had come from my account. I handed Maya the tuition records. She turned page after page. Freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, senior year. Every payment came from me. I don't understand, she whispered. I thought Dad. So did I. Jordan interrupted quietly. Neither of them looked at Victor. They kept reading. The room was so quiet that every page turning sounded impossibly loud. Finally, Maya closed the binder. She looked at her father. Is this true? Victor nodded once. Yes. Jordan's voice cracked. So every time I thanked you, you let me believe. I let all of you believe something that wasn't true. No excuses. No explanations. Just the truth. Maya's eyes filled with tears. She turned to me. You carried all of this by yourself? I nodded. I thought I was protecting our family. Jordan pushed his chair back. No. You were protecting Dad. The words hit harder than any accusation. Victor looked at his son. I never meant to hurt anyone. Jordan shook his head. Maybe not. But you let Mom sacrifice her health, her savings, and her future, while you accepted the credit. Victor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in years. No one was willing to rescue him from the consequences of his choices. I stood and walked to the window. I've made my decision. Everyone looked at me. I've spoken with an attorney. Victor's face went pale. I've asked for a legal separation. The room fell silent. I'm not doing this out of revenge. I'm doing it because I finally understand something. I turned back to face my family. A marriage cannot survive when one person keeps giving, and the other mistakes that love for obligation. Victor took one hesitant step toward me. Denise, I'll change. You should. I said it calmly. I truly hope you do. But the woman who waited 23 years isn't here anymore. No one cried. No one shouted. There was only silence. The kind of silence that comes when the truth has finally been spoken. As Victor sat alone at the dining table, surrounded by decades of financial records, he wasn't looking at numbers anymore. He was looking at the weight of every choice he had made. And for the first time, he understood exactly what it had cost him. 6 months later, I was living in a small townhouse 15 minutes from my old neighborhood. It wasn't as large as the house Victor and I had shared. It didn't have high ceilings or a 3-car garage, but every room felt peaceful. For the first time in years, I came home to silence that comforted me instead of silence that hid resentment. The legal separation had gone exactly as my attorney predicted. There were difficult conversations, stacks of paperwork, more than a few tears, but there were no battles over money. When the financial records were examined, the truth spoke for itself. Neither Victor nor his attorney argued with the numbers. They couldn't. 23 years of bank statements don't have opinions. They have facts. Because most of the marital assets had been built through my earnings and contributions, the settlement reflected that reality. As for Harold Whitmore's commercial property, it remained Victor's inheritance. I never asked for $1 of it. That wasn't the point. I hadn't walked away because I wanted his money. I walked away because I wanted my peace. One Saturday afternoon, Maya invited me to lunch. Jordan was already there. As we talked and laughed, Maya reached across the table. Mom, I've been thinking about something. What is it? You know all those years we thanked Dad for everything? I smiled gently. You don't have to apologize. But I want to. She squeezed my hand. I wish I had looked closer. So do I. Jordan leaned back in his chair. I called Dad last week. I looked at him. How is he? He took a slow breath. Different. Different how? He sold the commercial building. I raised an eyebrow. He did. Jordan nodded. He said he couldn't bring himself to keep it. He invested most of the money. And he paid off every debt he had. I was happy to hear it. Truly. Not because it changed anything between us, but because it meant he was finally taking responsibility for his own life. Then Jordan added something I wasn't expecting. He also started volunteering at a financial counseling center for married couples. I looked surprised. He tells men not to make the same mistakes he made. For a moment, none of us spoke. Maybe people really could change. But some lessons arrived too late to save the relationships they damaged. A few weeks later, I received a plain white envelope in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single handwritten note. It simply read, "Denise, for 23 years, you carried burdens that belonged to both of us. I kept thanking strangers for seeing me as a good man, while ignoring the woman who made that possible. Harold Whitmore believed I was patient. The truth is, I could afford to be patient because you carried every responsibility I refused to. The first honest thing I've done in a long time is admit that. I'm sorry, Victor." There was no request to come back. No promise that things would be different. No attempt to rewrite history. Just an apology. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Then I walked to the fireplace. I held it for one last moment. Not because I hated him, but because I no longer needed to carry his guilt, either. I dropped the letter into the flames. It curled slowly as the edges turned black. When it disappeared, I didn't feel triumph. I felt light. Some people think the most valuable thing you can lose is money. They're wrong. The most valuable thing you can lose is years spent believing your love has to be earned through sacrifice. I spent 23 years paying every bill in my marriage. The greatest debt I finally collected was the courage to choose myself. If you're listening to this story and you've been carrying a relationship on your shoulders alone, ask yourself one honest question. If you stopped carrying everything tomorrow, would your relationship stand on love, or would it collapse under the weight of one person's comfort? Sometimes, the answer to that question changes your life. And sometimes, it saves it.